Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Scottish viewers to this, the latest in a section of working lunches. Today, we're going to be talking about building a strong and sustainable advice firm through better understanding of regulation and technology. And who better to partner with us than the compliance specialists, Compliance First. My name's Andrew O'Kelly, and I'll be chairing the session today. We've got three fabulous speakers for you this afternoon, and let me introduce you to them now. They are Janice Lang, the Managing Director of Compliance First. Hello. Director of Compliance Policy from the Simply Biz Group, Richard Nuttall. And then in the final session, we'll be joined by Dan Russell, who's the Managing Director of Distribution Solutions at Simply Biz Group. Before we get into the event itself, there's just a couple of housekeeping notes that I'd like to run through with you, please. Your microphones are currently switched off. We'd appreciate it if you could keep it that way, and unless we are asking you to participate in the conversation, which we will, in which case if you could turn them on when you speak. But if you turn them off in the meantime, that just means there's no background noise and it's easy for everybody else. We'll be running some polls throughout today's session just to help it be a wee bit more interactive. You'll be able to see those as they go along. I'll run each poll for about 30 seconds and then show you the results afterwards. Now, there will be some audience participation today, we hope. We're a small-ish crowd today, and we thought it would be much nicer during the first session of the event if we could make it more participative. So if you wish to ask a question during the first part of the webinar, please do so. There's a couple of ways in which you can do that, either through the chat function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, or you could post a thumbs up. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's like a reactions button, and that shows us that you're wanting to say something, and either I or one of our speakers will pick up and let you into the conversation. At that point, please make sure you turn your microphone on when you're asking your question. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the event, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. So do again, please send your questions using the chat function, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. If you'd like those questions to remain anonymous, then just address them to me, Andrew O'Kelly, and I will ask them in an anonymous fashion at the end. I should tell you that today's session is being recorded for your CPD purposes principally, and we'll send you a link to the recording afterwards. Talking of CPD, you will, by virtue of attending this session, receive 1 hour's CPD, and we'll be sending you that proof of attendance later on today. And so, in true CPD style, let's just run through the learning objectives. The first session is going to be all around regulatory spotlight. We'll take a deep dive into the areas upon which the regulator is currently focusing and the things that advisors need to consider as a result. So we'll include SM and CR, the directory, vulnerable clients, suitability, and of course, DB pensions. And then we're going to sort of build upon those key drivers from the regulator. We're going to move into an exploration of how tech, processes and efficiencies can help you to meet them in a sustainable and repeatable manner. And then finally, to close the session, we're going to look at how all of this can be applied to your business in practical terms. And so that's where our specialist panel will take any of your questions about anything from regulation to strengthening your business operations. So let us get into our first session. Before I do, let me remind you, please participate, not just in the polls. If you've got a question that arises from anything that our two speakers are going to be talking about, then do either drop me a chat or put your hand up or put the thumbs up. So let's introduce our first two speakers this afternoon. They're Janice Lang, the Managing Director of Compliance First, and Richard Nuttall, who's Director of Compliance Policy at Simply Biz Group. And I think, Richard, you're going to start the session this afternoon. So let me hand over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. What a thoroughly charming introduction. It's just a shame I won't be able to continue in the same vein, but I'll start off by welcoming everyone here today. We really do appreciate you joining us. And I think, as alluded to by Andrew, this is further session that we're running. We ran one last week, and that was delivered by one of my colleagues, Mark Greenwood, and the session was recorded, and you may well have actually seen that presentation that Mark actually delivered. So what we felt would do now is perhaps try and make something a little bit more interactive. Now, not everyone might have seen last week's highlights. So what I thought I'd do is just overview some of those key areas, and then would like to open it up, maybe look at some of the questions we weren't able to touch upon last time, but perhaps more importantly, some of the questions that you may have, which is more relevant to you and your particular business. So as I say, just as a reminder to some of the key areas at the moment in time, many of you will probably remember a time far before called pre-lockdown. Actually, it wasn't called pre-lockdown because we didn't even know what lockdown actually was or knew anything about it. But many months ago, was in a situation where the regulator was very active in engaging with firms, and particularly for advice firms. They published this key letter, which was titled Dear CEO. And within that, there was 6 key areas of focus which the regulator was looking at. And this kind of got put on the back burner because everything that's happened since. But what we have started to see, and will continue to see, is the reintroduction of these 6 real pertinent areas, which will affect the vast majority of firms in that particular area of the markets. And some will affect all firms. So, for example, the senior managers and certification regime, all firms now will know the status of their firm within this particular regime. And I think it's fair to say each of you here today will form part of the core elements of that regime. And you'll have identified your senior managers, and you'll have identified your certified persons. You'll have done that before the end of last year. And then from that time until December this year, you will have to go through a process and create a body of evidence to demonstrate that each of those individuals are fit and proper for the roles that are carried out. Now, I know during the previous session, we carried out a number of polls, and I do believe it's really important that we continue with that, because I think it's always good to know what people's situations are, what their fellow peers are getting up to. So, Andrew, if you'd be kind of just to introduce the first poll, if that's okay. And I think that the thing with these fit and proper assessments is that for a lot of firms where there are sole directors of the firm, these assessments will be carried out upon themselves, and it means that they'll be carrying out fit and proper assessments. They'll be documenting this. If they're also a certified person, they'll be creating that certificate to demonstrate that they themselves are fit and proper for those particular activities. And it always seems a little bit surreal and a little bit strange to actually do that, but that's just the way that the rules are set out. And then once firms have completed those fit and proper assessments, they'll be able to identify which of the individuals will be become a directory person for it to be uploaded onto the directory, which will be launched towards the end of the year. It's great to see that the vast majority now have completed those fit assessments. You'll be able to identify, as I say, the directory persons to upload them onto the directory. Well, SMSCR captures every single firm. But within this DSCO, there are certain areas of specialism. So, for example, pension transfers. This won't affect every firm, but those firms that are affected will certainly be aware of it. The paper on contingent charging which was due out early in the year, got delayed. That's subsequently been published, and we know now, there's no surprise, there's going to be a ban on contingent charging. And actually, Andrew, if you don't mind, we've got a poll on this one as well, if you'd be kind enough just to launch that one as well. Now, I think the contingent charging ban was actually forced upon the regulator at a higher level, but it wasn't just as simple as banning the process of contingent charging. There was many other rules that were brought in to help aid the ban and to ensure it wasn't gamed in a way which would continue to deliver disproportionate levels of unsuitable advice. Such things as a bridge advice, which is a new form of advice, but is advice. Introduction on the receiving scheme being a workplace pension or being deemed as being the most suitable receiving scheme. Bringing in more disclosure to the client, more CPD for the pension transfer specialist. And I can see here there's about 1 in 4 firms are doing DB business. Do you know what would be interesting? That kind of replicates what we had the previous week. And I think if we took this poll 12, 24 months ago, I think we'll probably see a more equal display in terms of which firms actually hold this permission and don't. We have seen a reduction in capacity within the market, but there is still a great demand for advice in this particular area. And one of the things that the paper touches upon is the way in which 2 firms can work together, whether it be a simple introduction or whether it be a process where the investment firm actually gives advice on the receiving scheme and the 2 firms working together. I think what it will mean going forward is that wherever you are acting as an introducer, it will mean that you will need a new introducers agreement. A lot of areas have changed materially in this particular area. Thinking about how you work with the firm where they are delivering pension transfer advice. The end payment will be the same regardless to the outcome of that advice. And of course, if you are going to advise the client on the receiving scheme, you will have to share a lot of information with the pension transfer firm for them to aggregate all those charges to the client. And then there are other areas as well which are likely to affect all firms, which is assessing suitability, or to give it its full title, Assessing Suitability Review 2, because this follows on from a previous review. In fact, the previous review was more general. It covered over 600 firms, and quite a significant number of files were reviewed by the regulator. And I'd be interested to know, actually, if you were actually part of that original Assessing Suitability, or you have been called upon as part of this latest Assessing Suitability review. The latest one is far more focused. It will attract the attention of fewer firms directly, but it's more focused on retirement income. It's looking at firms where they advised clients to take the tax-free cash from the pension, or indeed have drawn down any income from that pension. And what the regulator will be doing, we know that the review on this has been delayed until the other part of next year, is looking at a number of files from the firms that have been called upon to assess the quality of that advice. And as we can see here, actually, I'm quite surprised the number of firms already that have been called upon within these 2 reviews. I think that, by the way, that the regulators called this Assessing Suitability Review 2 does mean this is a series of ongoing reviews. And I think they'll become more and more themed. Now, I've listened to many presentations on retirement income. One of the key subjects which is always touched upon is sequencing risk. Now, we've always spoken about that from a theoretical point of view. I think we've had some of the practical situations arise over the past 6 months or so. Now, this particular review won't factor in this latest downturn in the market, but I think as we go ahead on future reviews, I think there'll be a big part to play. So I think it's really important that firms do look at this and review their retirement income propositions. And you know, when we were on the first session, there was a number of questions we couldn't actually address. So, for example, on some of these subjects that we've covered already, firms wanting to know about the delay to the senior managers certification regime. Now, I better be careful what I say what I say here, because I think a lot of the confusions come from some of the press headline statements. And whilst they are factually correct, it doesn't always tell the actual true underlying picture, because the delay really is to individuals and firms that have been directly affected by COVID. And the regulator doesn't expect this to be a significant number of firms, but where there has been a delay because the firm has been subject directly, then the process of fit and proper can be extended till March of next year, the end of March. But as I say, I don't think the regulator would expect many firms to be applying that particular delay. But of course, T&C, fit and proper under SM&CR, well, this will create more and more responsibilities for firms. And it's clearly not a paper exercise, and it will bring ongoing challenges. And I'd like to actually just bring in yourself, Janice, if you don't mind, at the moment in time, because we can talk about the regulatory aspects about this, but there's also a lot of practical application in this particular area when we look at T&C and SM&CR. And just wondering, from that practical sense, are you seeing many firms, whilst they can't outsource the responsibility, are we seeing many firms outsource a lot of the practical day-to-day duties?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of different things going on at the moment, Richard. First of all, it's great to see that over 80% are organised and sorted for SM&CR. We do tend to find that historically there's been some firms that tend to sort of kick T&C to the side, or we'll do that later, I'll do some file reviews, new business is more important. And you can understand in some respects that rationale, but T&C's been around for a very long time, and really it's now time for those firms, they have to sit up and make sure that they're carrying out the work that's required, because that body of evidence in order to certify someone, as you've mentioned, doesn't come around easily. We reckon it's probably about 43, 44 hours a year per advisor to carry that out. And how we come to that figure is basically saying, if you were to do a file check each month on each advisor, if you were to do a skills observation, if you were to collate their KPI documentation, the types of new business they write, any complaints, review their CPD, it's about 43, 44 hours in the year. And a number of firms do decide to outsource that work to the likes of ourselves or someone else in the marketplace. Alternatively, they might outsource some parts and say, well, I don't have time for the file reviews, but personally I would like to do the skills observations and do the one-to-ones. So there's different options there. There is no doubt if you do all your own in-house compliance and reviews, that's great, but it's good to have a third party review it as well. And also, as you mentioned earlier, when you have sole traders, sometimes sole traders think, that advice will be fine, but you forget they're not bouncing off anybody else in the office that says, oh, I might have done it this way, or have you thought about that as well? So again, file reviews for sole traders are a really important part, and I think a lot of people miss that part. So the sort of long answer to your question, but there are more people now definitely outsourcing it, and again, as technology advances, these things will be easier as well. The uploading of files was maybe quite alien to people previously, but doing that sort of thing and doing remote observations are just so much easier. So whilst we've had some horrendous times through the lockdown period, we've certainly learned a lot that will help us going forward.
I think you raised something there which is really relevant, Janice, and that's under the sole director, because we probably get more questions in terms of sole directors, when that person is the firm itself, and the question is, do we really have to do this? I mean, surely this seems illogical to have to take this particular approach, but the rules are the rules that the way they're laid out, and it's a lot certainly under SM&CR is established through government legislation as opposed to directly FCA legislation. I think it's a really good point you talk about there about the file reviews. I think it's always important to remember that we all look at the world through a different set of eyes, and what we might think is appropriate, someone else may not. And unfortunately, if that someone else is the Ombudsman or the FCA, then it puts that individual in a very, very difficult position. And listen, for all these rules and for everything we talk about, the reality is the biggest risk that advisors have is the advice they deliver. And when you are incredibly close to it, sometimes, you know, you can't actually see that. So I think it's just to support what you said. I think it's a really good idea for all advisors to have those independent checks on the business that they're writing. I mean, I spoke before about pension transfers, Janice. I mean,
Yeah.
the FCA reviews highlighted a disproportionate level of unsuitable advice. Do we see kind of a heavy focus on file reviews for that type of business?
Yeah, there's definitely, again, at the moment, Richard, you know, obviously pre-pensions freedom, you would hardly get any occupational cases to review. Although file reviewing was ongoing at that time, there'd be very few come in. Obviously post-pensions freedom, it really went to a real spike and a real frenzy, and then it's died down again over the last year or two, but certainly over the last couple of months. I mean, the one area from that slide in front of us there that the FCA has not taken their eye off the ball is DB transfers, without a shadow of a doubt, and we're now seeing a number of FCA interventions, them going back to firms and saying, we reckon a past business review is required. And some of these firms have written hundreds and hundreds of cases, some have written 7 or 8, but they're looking for that past business review. So we are definitely seeing an increase in the number of files that are required to be reviewed, either as a consequence of an FCA intervention or alternatively a complaint now, Richard, as well. You know, firms coming across that and saying, can you review that to check the suitability of advice? And we come across the same things, whether it be a pension transfer or an investment file review or a mortgage file review. It's quite often it's just not clearly documented. It's very clear to that individual, and that comes back to if you're an advisor working on your own, you're maybe very sure that everything's there. But if somebody else is a second pair of eyes is sitting there, can they see what you see? Because they don't necessarily have everything that you know and that you're aware of in the client in your head, and that's what the regulator obviously looks at, the hard facts that are written down on the piece of paper. So it's a sort of yes, no, yes answer. Yes, there was a big increase, then it went down, and yes, it's going back up again for sure.
Yeah. Well, let me just say this. I know that next week we are going to be within the SimplyBiz group running a clinic on the new pension transfer rules and how it affects those firms, but also as well those firms which are introducing business. And I just like to make an open invitation. If anyone is interested in joining us on that, it's only an hour session. Let us know, and you can join us, and you can ask specific questions on that particular area and hear what other firms' questions, and hopefully we'll be able to give some answers to that. I mean, I don't know if anyone's got any questions on that or any other aspects of these kind of 6 key areas which the regulator are looking at the moment in time. If we don't hear from Andrew, perhaps the only other thing I'd like to highlight is vulnerability. And we do know that whilst vulnerability wasn't within that DSCO, the thing with vulnerability, it just affects absolutely every single firm and potentially a lot of clients as well. So just let me start off by asking the people who joined us today, if your firm does actually have a vulnerable persons policy. And while you're doing that, the reason why I'm specifically mentioning this now is that you may well have seen over the past few weeks, the regulator have issued another guidance consultation paper on vulnerability. And I think it's really important that if you haven't seen or read this, that you do so. We do know that this is quite a relevant question, and it's pleasing to see that the majority do have a policy. But as I say, it's well worth having a read this paper, because it is something that the regulator are questioning firms on at the moment in time. And what I would say about vulnerability is, and this is kind of my takeaways from that particular paper, is it's about firms having an understanding of the different types of vulnerabilities and how that affects their clients and some of the actions that can result because of that. It's about ensuring that all relevant individuals within the firm have and receive training. It's not just about the advisors, anyone who has client contact. Think about the way in which you communicate with those clients. Think about the way in which you service those clients and establish and design services. And of course, above all, how you monitor everything, you know, how you identify, how you record information, and how you learn from that going forward. But it's very difficult because a lot of this is principles based and there's no actual rules. And I suppose, Janice, the way I see it is it's just about doing the right thing with the right people based on their situation.
Yeah, I think it is, Richard, but it is, obviously it's very, vulnerability in any shape or form is very sensitive. We've never been in a situation where there are potentially more people vulnerable for one reason or another. So I think there's the practical aspects, as you've said, about the identification, the recording and the staff training. But there's a big thing around soft skills as well. Do your staff have the ability, to deal with people in different scenarios? I think it's easy to think that everyone's the same, or, oh, that person's bereaved, so they'll maybe react in this way, or that's, this has happened to somebody else, they've got money issues or money concerns. But the reality is they're not all the same issues, and nobody walks in anybody else's shoes. They can react in different ways, they can behave in different ways. So I think soft skills are really, really important. At the present time, you'd mentioned assessing suitability. We've run some workshops in that, but we're at the moment just devising vulnerable customer training. So it's not just about yes, there's the documentation and the policies that you need as well, but help and give these soft skills to individuals so they can really appropriately deal with the people. One other warning sort of shot around vulnerability as well is taking a step back just from the individuals. There is also the part which is, what is your business model? We have seen some business models which focus predominantly, for example, in debt counselling, and debt consolidation. Now, those types of businesses are likely that the majority, if not all of their clients, could be vulnerable because they're in a financial situation that they're in debt and they're seeking help with that debt. So that they could have the debt problem, they could have other issues, they could have mental health issues, there's lots of other things. But as a business, is your business at risk because the nature of what your proposition is as well? So clearly those types of businesses, it needs to be even tighter in terms of how they deal with the clients and, making sure that they're not, the customer has not been disadvantaged as a consequence of their vulnerability.
Yeah,
I've got a question just come through. It's sort of going back a little bit further, but it's I haven't signed an advisor off as competent. How does that affect the fit assessment?
Absolutely, it affects it because there's the sort of three key areas, which is around financial soundness and capability, and the T&C part is the capability part. So if you've not signed somebody off in terms of having observed them in the field, looked at file checks, etc., then you're going to have an issue with that. I don't know if Richard, if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I think that's certainly correct. I suppose it depends upon the stage of the individual and when they join the business. Fit and proper is separate to T&C, but I don't think you can disregard either or when making the assessments. What I mean by that is when you first have an individual join the firm who are going through a competency assessment, you will still be able to assess them as fit and proper based upon qualifications, maybe the past experiences, etc., etc. And then they'll go through a program of competency. And I suppose at that point in time, you may separate the two. But I think once you get to a position where an individual is competent, I think you will have to align those two assessments because competency is aligned to the fit and proper. It is one of the three segments within there. I suppose what you're thinking about there, Janice, if you're not able to sign someone off as competent because they don't meet standards, then you're quite right. Without question, it would impact directly on their fit and proper assessments. But it's not to say that if you've got a new joiner and they're not competent, they can't be fit and proper.
Another one here, whilst we're on fit assessments, will a DBS check have to form a part of my annual fit assessment?
Well, I'll hand this one to you, Janice, if I may.
Yeah, that's fine. DBS check being a criminal record check. Criminal record checks are required at outset of, so if a new firm is going to have a new senior manager, a criminal record check is required at that point for the application for that role. It is not required thereafter, but our recommendation is if somebody is a senior manager, it would be worthwhile a firm considering perhaps doing a check every 3 years. Under the sort of normal training, competence and certification, as we would say, a credit check is good to do on every member of staff, but the criminal record check only applies to the senior managers.
Okay, and another one, hasn't SM&CR been delayed until next year?
Richard?
Yeah, well, that's something I touched on before, and you know, you will see headline statements which do state that. But as I say, the devil is always in the detail when it comes to some of these headline statements, in so much that it only applies to individuals, firms which have been directly affected by COVID. And I think the regulator alluded to this within their policy statements on this, that they don't expect many firms to be that directly affected whereby they can't carry out the fit and proper assessments. And I think, you know, in terms of what we've seen today in terms of responses, it's great to see that the vast majority have been able to conclude that particular assessments well in advance of the deadline, so they haven't been significantly affected. And of course, there's still several months to go before that deadline date. I think what's really important about that is then getting people onto the directory in good time before its launch.
I think the key word there, Richard, is the significant part, isn't it? Has there been significant disruption to the business? Yes, there's been disruption to all businesses, but it's clarified, you know, what does significant actually mean, you know, and our view and our experience of the regulator is they're looking for it to be pretty significant for you to justify why you hadn't actually dealt with it.
Yeah, it's a great cop-out phrase, isn't it? To actually, without giving any true meaning to what it is.
Yeah.
Very, very ambiguous indeed. But hopefully it shouldn't be a concern for the vast majority of firms.
And the key thing really is to the message is to make sure not to leave it to the last minute, make sure you're well prepared. No more questions at this point, but do please keep them coming in. I'm sure that our speakers will be happy to answer.
Thank you, Andrew.
Perfect. So, I mean, we could touch upon PI, but quite negative, I'd say, Janice. And I just wanted to touch on resources, if I may, very, very, very briefly, because the two do link together. And I think we are starting to see that the regulator now look more closely at firms and the PI cover. And I think it is becoming a very tough market. I think firms are experiencing an awful lot of difficulty when it comes to renewals, whether that's through a price increase, whether it's through limitations on the cover. And I'm sure if we ran a poll, which we're not going to do, but I'm sure if we did run one, we'd probably see that most firms have been affected in one of those two ways at the point of renewal. But I think as a result of that, the regulator kind of looking at this and starting to ask an awful lot more questions. We're certainly starting to see that on firms which are authorised for pension transfers. I mean, the level of detail that firms have to report now to the regulator in that particular area is quite incredible. Firms that once had that particular permission and no longer have it, well, there's a question about how they cover past business, whether that PI does that, whether they're having to self-insure, and if they're having to self-insure, then it brings further questions upon those capital resources. You know, these can be big challenges for firms, and I think that it's a very simple message in terms of PI, that I think in the past PI used to be a numbers game when it came to underwriters. I think going forward it's more about risk, and what that will mean is that it's going to be more important than ever to look at PI well before renewal and actually have a conversation. Speak to the underwriter, talk to them about your processes, the solutions that you deliver, and that will be aligned to things like your centralized investment process. It will be aligned to your prod assessments, your research and due diligence, to show the outputs, the types of recommendations, the types of clients, so they have a better understanding of the type of business that they're looking to insure. And hopefully that way then you'll be able to obtain more favourable terms, or perhaps not so many limitations on the cover. But you know, we do know that many firms are suffering quite significantly at the moment in time. There's that word again, Janice, in this particular area. I don't know if you've had any kind of direct dealings with firms?
Yeah, I mean, it's very challenging without a shadow of a doubt. You know, the capacity in the market's not great. Premiums, we've probably seen about 50% of firms have an increase in premiums of 20% or more. You know, and some, you know, with very vanilla type business that they write and what have you as well. So certainly very, very challenging, but no doubt sort of concur with what you're saying in terms of how robust is your business and your processes. You know, are they documented? Have you got it there? The better documented, the more you can demonstrate what you're doing, you know, to be meeting regulator requirements and what have you as well. Really is, the better, but very challenging times. And it'll be interesting to see if MJ's got any questions at the end for us on that, because it is very topical, and you know, this from some of the sessions you've ran for our clients and members, Richard, that's definitely of interest to people. So again, if MJ's got any questions towards the end and after Dan's session, then we'd be glad to take them from you.
Okay.
Well, if I may just say, so I think talking about those solutions and talking about the problems with that assessing suitability, maybe an ideal opportunity to bring in Dan. Would you agree, Andrew?
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, I'm sure Dan's waiting in the wings. So as we move on now to the second part of our discussion today, Dan Russell, who's the Managing Director of Distribution Solutions at Simply Biz Group, is going to talk to us about running a robust advisory business. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Andrew. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Ricky, Janice. Great to see some familiar names on the list of attendees here, by the way. Hello to those that I know, and some of our existing customers and Compliance First. Some of the themes that Ricky and Janice have touched on there are some of the challenges being laid down from a regulatory perspective. Obviously, regulatory challenges are kind of a hurdle to come over during the course of actually running a profitable business, which is ultimately what I believe most advisory businesses are in business for. So you've got to be compliant because you've got to be, but profitable because it's usually a lot more fun running a business when you are profitable. And there is there's a perception that that it's all a great big slog to overcome the regulatory hurdles, when actually I think that when you look at some of the other hurdles around delivering really good outcomes for clients, around doing that in an efficient way that drives maximum profitability from that client base and from their fees, and utilizing technology in the right way to do that, you end up tackling many of the key regulatory challenges along the way by virtue of having those processes in place. And in being asked to talk about, I guess, our experiences as a group of companies in dealing with advisory firms and what makes a good, robust advisory practice from a profitability and an outcome perspective, I'm going to go against the grain of what we're really asked to talk about and say that it's not about technology. It's not about technology. It's about the right processes being in place and then applying it correctly inside technology. The best analogy I can think of, and it is a torturous one, but to bear with me, but I know that Janice is a keen golfer and a much better golfer than I ever want to be. As a golfer, I'd make a really good rugby player. But when playing golf, I'm led to believe that, you know, you can have the very best set of clubs possible. You could spend an awful lot of money on golf clubs. If you've got a really rubbish swing and you move your head around all over the place, it's going to make absolutely no bit of difference. And I guess the same is true of technology in the advice space. If your process isn't right and the inputs into it aren't right, no amount of technology is going to solve that. So actually, I think the real traits of an good advisory practice, and I've shared just a few high-level ones up on the screen. It's really mostly about the process and having those well-documented processes to start with. Because if you can document what it is you're doing, articulate it to yourself, and then you can articulate it to staff, if there are any, or just to yourself if you're a sole trader. And you can articulate that to your customers. You can then articulate that to the regulator. And then you can get to the point where you can review and monitor all of that on an ongoing basis using data. And then you can really say that, you know what, we are tackling all the key issues here. We're delivering for our customers, and we know that we're doing all of that in the most efficient way possible. So I think one of the key things to look at is the way in which people are documenting processes, and then whether or not the technology is actually working for them. Because an awful lot of time we encounter advisory businesses where they're working for the technology, they're changing processes to fit the technology, or they've got so much technology that they can't actually make it all work together. I've got a poll that I'd be interested in bringing up to start with about how people perceive the use of technology in their business right now, as to how well integrated you think it is. Is it perfectly integrated? You've got one seamless system. You're doing planning, research, suitability, back office, and all of the data shared across it. Or are you relying on several different systems, and some of them don't share data? Or you're not really on that journey. You're just using standalone systems for each task. You know, I want risk profiling over here, and I've got cash flow modeling over there, and I've got a back office system over here. And at the moment you're quite content with them all being where they are. And there's no right or wrong answer to any of this. It's just interesting to see the temperature of the room. When it comes to the processes, interestingly, 80% on different systems and 20 on using standalone ones. It's rare to find the top one, the first answer there of being perfectly integrated, no data transfer, everything being seamlessly integrated with the right data of all those processes. When it comes to the processes that I think need to be documented, it's quite simplistic in my mind. It's who are the different sets of customers that you've got, and it may be one set. There's only one type of customer and one type of service, but there may be several. Who are those different types of customers? What service are you going to offer them? And then how are you going to execute delivering that service? And within those processes, there's all sorts of different things, but ultimately that's really all it boils down to. You know, inside what it is you're going to offer them, you're then starting to look into your supply chain of how you build the relevant solutions for people. But if you can understand and document those processes, I think that's the first trait that really robust advisory practices are putting in place. I think the second is then a ruthless focus on the customer outcome. And regardless of the perception that this is a regulatorily led marketplace, I think it's actually one that demonstrates time and time again that the intermediary market in the UK is really good at focusing on customer outcomes and delivering a really good job for those customers of those services. And the idea around goals-based financial planning really helps here. It's being able to articulate what it is that the customer wants to do. And this is where, I mean, technology can help here an awful lot in extracting the right mandate from the customer. I've got this money and I want to protect against this happening. Or I've got this money and I want to grow it to be a larger pot of money over time. I've got this money and I want an income in my retirement from it, please. And being able to really clearly and simplistically articulate with the customer a mutually understood plan that may have all sorts of really complex stuff sitting behind it, but ends up being a very simple, easily understood plan for the customer based on their goals is a key aspect. Outcome-based, goals-based planning in the customer's own language. I think another fundamental area that is very much coming to the fore at the moment is around the quality and the extent of the supply chain that then sits underneath the delivery of that service. And when it's in particular in the investments and pensions world, the cornerstone of that supply chain, I think, needs to be really, really good strategic asset allocation capability. I think that the retail advice market in the UK has made great strides over the last 10 years or more in moving towards a more granular approach to this, in building, methodology behind their asset allocation decisions. Some of the planning tools that are available out there, usually risk profile led planning tools, have had quite a rudimentary approach to this. They've had things like asset allocation, volatility, and potential returns, and maybe a correlation of matrix between the asset classes as to how they work independent or not independent of each other. And then they run a spreadsheet, and out pops, a 1 to 10 risk profile, maybe with a set of asset allocations behind it on a spreadsheet. And that's helped move the journey along. But when you look at what's happening institutionally around the world in terms of some of the ways in which customers are serviced, particularly by large global pension schemes and the advisors to them, etc., there's a real granularity of detail that you can go into that the retail market, I think, has been missing. We've been doing an awful lot of work in the background of our businesses, in particular with Defaqto, the advice technology and research arm of our group, and in our investment services division, to bring that institutional grade thinking to the fore, to have really granular and dynamic approaches to being able to create an asset allocation, bringing in third-party expertise into the supply chain when required, and then being able to shift and deliver a different set of underlying assumptions based on that mandate that's been extracted from the customer. One particular area, and it was touched on by Ricky and Janice, is around the regulators' focus on clients who are taking an income in retirement, and the review of suitability in that area that's underway at the moment. I've got a poll here for you that I'm interested as to whether or not people use a different advice process for growth and retirement income clients. In some instances, people use the same risk, asset allocation, and investment selection process. Some might have the same risk and asset allocation process, but different products and funds. Or have you got a process that distinguishes entirely between the two, where everything about the delivery of that service is different, dependent on the pot of money being used for growth or for retirement income? Again, there's no right or wrong answer. The prevalence in the market has been for using the same approach, because it's become a very risk profile driven advice, investment and pensions market. But those risk profiles and their underlying asset allocations have all been based on, that's really interesting, sort of a neat split between them, with the most using the same process but with different products and funds. The ability to distinguish the asset allocation methodology between retirement income and growth, I think going forward is going to be key. Growth assumptions around return and around volatility, and I think will, in retirement income, be moved aside in favour of a focus on things like the sequencing of returns risk rather than volatility, and on things like coverage ratio rather than return. Coverage ratio being, if you wanted a pound of income, if you didn't get the pound of income, did you get 99p or did you get 1p? Because that's a huge difference to the outcome for the customer, and how asset classes will or won't deliver that income target. And we've, for example, been building a very different modelling process for where a customer's deriving a specific retirement income mandate. I want this amount of income over this number of years, and I'd like this level of residual pot left at the end. We think that demands a very different answer to, I've got £100,000 and I'd like to grow it within these volatility boundaries at risk profile 5, please. So a key aspect, I think, is going to be is in delivering the underlying supply chain to those mandates that you've extracted from the customer. And then you've got the job of picking out the supply chain. And by the supply chain, I mean the funds, the models, the platforms, the pensions, the protection policies that you are going to use to deliver that plan for the customer based on the methodology that you've used. And having a well-researched supply chain, there's no right or wrong answer to who you use or don't use for any of these types of things. It's just about understanding whether or not you do. Interesting to pick up here, actually, they've just been prompted as to whether or not people's asset allocation strategy is their own, is a third party's, or a third party's, but you give it a bit of a tweak and you use them as the base point. I think that research supply chain is key to make sure that you're able to articulate why it is that after all of that documenting of your process, the extraction of the mandate and the delivery of institutional grade thinking behind it, why does that customer end up with that product and not one of the thousands of others that other ones they could have done? And being able to document why you're filtering in that way and going down from that point of view. Interesting, a neat split there between people using third parties or using their own approach. Again, no right or wrong answer. Once you've got that, once you've got your process documented, you've got your planning approach, you're extracting a customer's mandate based on their needs in their language, you've got real institutional grade thinking behind how you're going to create the outcomes, and then you've researched a supply chain that can deliver it, and you know that manufacturer has got a solution that logically links to the methodology you're using to deliver that customer's plan. That's at my point where the right technology comes in. It's being able to find technology that can deliver that, rather than having technology that demands you work in a certain way. And as much as possible to have it all in one place, so that you can undertake risk profiling, asset allocation, goals-based planning, research, and a suitability report, for example, all in one place without there being any logical flaws between different systems, or crucially, and it may seem trivial, but it's actually a single biggest source of problems on file reviews, rekeying of information between systems and getting a detail wrong that means that there's an inconsistency. And that's where the right technology comes in the advice process side of things. It can then help when it comes to the delivery post the advice of those ongoing client communications. And I think the last 5 months or so that we've all lived through has demonstrated what we probably already knew, which is that very targeted, specific communications pertinent to that customer, delivered in the right way through the right method, is key to maintaining key to maintaining the perception of value of the advice process in the minds of the customer. And the last 5 months I don't think they have changed the way in which people do this. I think they've just accelerated the way in which people do it. And we, for example, have built into our advice process and our advice technology the ability for advisors to interact with customers inside the technology via video conferencing. That's been hugely popular. And the very nature of the fact that we are all meeting and discussing like this demonstrates that even further. But the key aspect to those client communications is to be reinforcing at every stage the value of the advice that they've been given, the fact that you are there and thinking about them, and that you're delivering information that's pertinent to them on an ongoing basis. And having done all of that, I think you're then in a position, if you've got the process documented, you can do the planning, goals-based planning with that institutional grade thinking behind it, with a really well-researched and clear supply chain, powered by the right technology and communicating in the right way with the customer. You're able to review and monitor all of that and use real data to demonstrate that we said we were going to do this, we have done that, our customers say this, our feedback is that, and we can clearly say to anybody who ever comes a knocking, whether it's a customer or maybe even the regulator who says, tell me about the suitability of your advice for clients who are taking an income in retirement. Here's our process, here's how we've lived it, and here's the data that demonstrates that we have done. And I think that's a key development over the last few years, is the ability of advisors to utilize that data to demonstrate the robustness of what it is that they're doing. And ultimately that boils down to really delivering the right thing for the customer and doing it in a way that is efficient and drives down the underlying costs of doing it and increases the profitability of doing it as a consequence. Those are some of the traits that we see out there, and that's driving some of the most successful firms that we're working with. I'm hoping that we've been inundated by questions that we can pick up. Andrew, how have we done? Have we been swamped by a deluge of the most pertinent questions possible?
Well, you'd be surprised. Thank you very much, Dan, for that really insightful presentation. Yes, I've got a couple of questions, but sir, we've got 5 minutes or so to get through this, and certainly would welcome some more, I'm sure. First question was, what new rules do we need to follow to be compliant with vulnerability?
Richard, you had touched on that earlier. I think what we've got here around vulnerability is not so much, what specifically do we need to follow. A lot of it's principle based, and you have to consider what your firm is, what type of advice and the type of clients that you deal with. Richard, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, there's no rules as such, but I'll try and give a couple of takeaways if I can on this one. The first one is to read that latest FCA paper. You'll find that on the FCA website. I think it's really insightful. I think that ensuring you have evidence that you've carried out training for all the appropriate staff. I think it's important that you review the way in which you deliver some of the services. Some will be services which will go as to vulnerable individuals because of the nature of the particular product. Other times you may have to identify where individuals are vulnerable, and think of a way in which you record the fact the individual is vulnerable and any resulting outcome from that, and how you use that information to develop and design the approach you take for future types of vulnerable individuals. So that's probably the kind of the overlay I'd put on that, as opposed to any direct change to rules themselves.
Interestingly, just very briefly as an aside, there was a firm who had an FCA call 2 weeks ago, and it was around DBs, but they also asked them what they were doing with vulnerable customers. And that individual was able to say, well, I've read that paper, I'm familiar, blah, 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 I can have access to Hub. So quite interesting that the FCA are in something, but they're checking how the firms are doing on other key points of interest to them.
It's a very relevant point, because I think one of the problems with pension transfers is the ban on contingent charging, and the biggest impact is on vulnerable clients.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that they would have had to pay for advice when they're problematic in position to pay for advice.
That's a very comprehensive answer. We've got a couple more questions here, and I'm keen to make sure we get those in before we run out of time. Here's an interesting one. Are we advisors going to come under pressure on pricing in the coming years, particularly with demonstrating the value of ongoing advice fees?
No.
There's a short answer.
and without being flippant, I'll briefly explain why I think that they won't. The advisors in the UK now have the customer relationship. I think the pressure is on the fund managers, it's on the platforms and the product providers, and probably in the order of platforms first, expensive DFMs second, expensive fund managers third, and then the tax wrapper and product providers. But if you've got the relationship with the customer, if it's all about your service, and all of those other component players are suppliers to your service, you're in charge of dictating how much of that cost drag comes through from manufacturers and how much your service costs. But everything that I see in the marketplace, and every every leader of every manufacturing business that I speak to, they're all of the view that the advisors have got the upper hand here. The value is going to be in the advice, and that's where the least drag is going to be on cost and value perception.
Let me just very briefly pick up on that, because I agree entirely. From a regulator point of view, they're not looking to drag down the cost of advice. What they are looking to do through a range of policy papers is to drag down the cost of the ancillary products and supplies that the intermediary would use, whether it be for the platform review, whether it be through the asset management review, etc.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll finish up with one final question. Will pension transfer rules end up becoming rules for all types of business?
Well, if we could extend this for another hour, that'd be great to answer that one. Look, very, very briefly, a lot of the rules have been changed based on anecdotal evidence. There's no hard evidence to support a lot of these changes. Some make sense, others a little bit confusing. The regulator made a point of saying that they will only apply to pension transfers and not to any other type of investments because of the complexity on transfers. If it demonstrates there's a significant improvement in the outcomes of pension advice, I think they will be inclined to review some of these changes for other types of investments if they can demonstrate it's producing better client outcomes. So there is no intention to this at the moment in time, but I think we have to keep it under review.
With a big caveat that there's that huge advice gap that they know about, and that any move to do that across, let's say somebody wanted some advice on their ISA and their pension, and it was nothing to do with a transfer in any way, shape, or form. Anything further that exacerbated the ability of people to access advice in the UK would not be politically astute. But then again, people are always doing things that aren't very politically astute.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. That brings us neatly to an end of our hour, which I think has been very entertaining and highly informative. So let me, first of all, thank our speakers, to Janice, to Richard, and to Dan. Thank you very much indeed for what was a really enlightening presentation. Before we depart today, just wanted to let you know, if you've enjoyed this event today, a couple more upcoming digital events that Professional Advisor are running. If you're in and around the Edinburgh or Glasgow areas, you may well have attended our multi-asset roadshows in the past. COVID obviously has put paid to that, so we're now running it over 2 days as an online masterclass, the 7th and 8th of September, just 2.5 hours each day. Hopefully that will be manageable for you. And you can see presentations from Aegon Asset Management, Baillie Gifford, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, Orbis, and Schroders, who are launching 6 new multi-asset strategies at this event. And then ESG, which is very big in the news at the present time, with all the MiFID regulations coming in next year. The 27th and 28th of October, you can see presentations from Aberdeen Standard Capital, Aegon Asset Management, Baillie Gifford, Pictet, and Schroders. And we'll send you details of how you can register for those events in the email that you'll receive later on, with a link to the recording of this presentation, and also, of course, your CPD proof of attendance. So again, all that remains for me to do is to thank our speakers, to Janice, to Richard, and to Dan. Thank you so much. Let me reserve the bulk of our thanks to you, our viewers, to tuning in this lunchtime. Thank you so much. We hope you've enjoyed it, and very much hope to see you at one of our other events again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.